Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 9th of May. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, murderous budget cuts are not a necessity, they are a choice. And the feeding frenzy of financial speculation that must be taxed and killed. First, murderous budget cuts are not a necessity, they are a choice. So, Craig, Joe Hockey, our fearless treasurer, is preparing his budget, and it's a big deal. Tony Abbott had to put off a trip to Indonesia to be here for this. This is their first budget. You know, there's a lot, I don't have to tell the audience, there's a lot hanging on it. People who watch us on YouTube will see this before the budget's handed down. People on Channel 31 will see this afterwards. So all the media discussions about this. What I want to do is highlight the number one criteria that is shaping Joe Hockey's budget. And it's not what people think it is. The number one criteria for Joe Hockey's budget is pleasing the bankers to whom he thinks run the economy. Right? So I got a quote here from a speech that Joe Hockey gave in London in April 2012. So more than a year before they took government, and they fully expected to take government. And this speech is to the Institute of Economic Affairs, and that's the leading Thatcherite think tank in London. In fact, Thatcherite, calling them Thatcherite is wrong. These people trained Margaret Thatcher. They used to say, we're not Thatcherite, she's an IEAite, right? So these are the hardest of hardcore economic rationalists, and it's actually a front for this fascist economics think tank called the Mont Pelerin Society. So this is what Hockey said in that speech. In today's global financial system, it is the financial markets, both domestic and international, which impose fiscal discipline on countries. Lenders have a more active role to play in policing public policy and ensuring that countries do not exceed their capacity to service and repay debt. This is playing out most dramatically in Europe. Adam Smith's free hand is perfectly capable of forming a fist to punish nations who ignore the fundamental rules. So that's quite explicit.
Robbie, this is nothing. We're going to say more about this, of course, in the course of our discussions. But look, this idea is nothing more than the bloody-minded attitude of the bankers that created the Great Depression.
Yep.
And people who don't know history don't know what I'm necessarily talking about.
Which is, we're in charge, and we call the shots when it comes to the economy. Governments, you do as you're told.
That's right, and that's the problem. You know, back in the 1930s, you had some very brave Labor people in the old Labor Party actually say, no, it's the role of government to control the banks, and they had the Commonwealth Bank to do that. And they tried to, but everywhere they went, the British bankers said, no way, you guys are going to take your orders from us. We're not going to allow you to do anything for your economy. And basically, we're responsible for the desperation, misery of millions of people in Australia from right through the Great Depression, right up until the war years, and even into the war years.
Now, Craig, things haven't always been like that, and because of, we're going to talk about this a bit, but because of what happened in the war and afterwards, the culture changed a bit, and the average person would think, no, well, of course the government should be the ultimate authority over the banks. The banks should do it as they're told, right? They can't be allowed to run the government. But what we're dealing with is a particularly hardcore ideology that's taken over Australia since the 1980s. And I got another quote here that shows just how much this was a choice by the government of the day, Hawke and Keating, to hand this power over to the markets and the banks. So this is from Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly is the senior politics scribe for the Australian newspaper, and you can see him on Sky News, and you know, he does these long-winded expositions of what's happening in Australia at the moment and why, blah, blah, blah. So he wrote the definitive history of politics in the 1980s in a book called The End of Certainty. Now, and Kelly, of course, the other thing about him is he's Murdoch's main commentator. He's for the Murdoch media empire, which, you know, is 70% of the media here. So listen to this quote. He's in this particular chapter that he writes this paragraph in, he's talking about In 1986, there was a dollar crisis. The dollar had been floated in 1983, and in 1986 it really started to plunge. And that threw the government, the Hawke-Keating government, into a crisis, and there's all this, they had to do all this frantic budget balancing to try and rectify this situation, right? Because they didn't have any control over the dollar. So this is what Paul Kelly wrote. Quote, "The power bestowed by the float on the currency markets was never more manifest. The marketplace was imposing upon Australia a regime of fiscal severity which the Labor Party had never remotely entertained. It was a demonstration of the consequences of Keating's internationalisation of the economy." So my point is, it's a choice. The government put in place a policy, the float, which was a choice to give power over them to the financial markets, right? And that's the way Australia's been governed ever since. So what Hockey's doing now is just continuing, I would argue in a bit more of an extreme way, but it's the same essence. This is not picking on the Liberals. Liberal and Labor are equally bad on this. They both agree that the markets are in charge and governments have to do as they're told. So what does that mean practically? Well, let's look at what we think might be in the budget a little bit. We've had the National Commission of Audit, which we call the National Commission of Austerity. This whole thing's a charade, right? Hockey and Abbott got elected knowing full well what they were going to do. They had to go through the charade of having this audit commission that can just, in fact, probably argue for much more severe things than even Hockey and Abbott were going to do, so that when Hockey and Abbott finally announce it next week, people might even be relieved or slightly relieved, whereas on its own merits, they probably wouldn't have. Some things that are quite clear though, this budget will target the poor and the elderly, right? And you can see it in raising the pension age.
The ones that actually don't have a vote or a voice.
Yeah, exactly.
Voice, yeah.
It's got raising the pension age, which might not hurt an elderly investment banker, but it's certainly going to hurt an elderly blue-collar worker, right, in a bad way. I was talking to a farmer this week, Craig, who, when we talked about this, they say they have to raise the pension age. He said, well, hang on, Hockey says we've had 22 years of uninterrupted economic growth. Shouldn't we be able to lower the pension age? Right? Because it's counterintuitive. It shows you they're lying about something. A particularly bad one is the Medicare co-payment. It sounds like a small amount, $6 to $15 maybe, but who goes to the doctors the most by necessity? Elderly people, right? Elderly pensioners. Last week, the Medicare architect was on the radio and he said, if it's $6, that's only 2 cups of coffee a week. Well, as someone I know pointed out, pensioners would never spend $3 on a cup of coffee.
I think to highlight that point, Robbie, I went to the doctor to get a flu shot, and the doctor asked me, are you on any medication, because I'm over 50. And he was astounded that I was one of the exceptions that wasn't taking any medication, and I'm over 50.
Yeah, right.
So you start to think, well, if people are taking medication, they have to see their doctors more often, which is highlighting the point you're making. The more elderly people have to see the doctors by necessity.
Exactly. And genuine pensioners don't have a lot of money, and that $6,
that's a lot
every
of money.
time they do it, 2 or 3 times a week, however often they go, will add up and add up and add up. And the people who are architects of this, they're not oblivious to this, they know it. There's a real intention here. We see that, Hockey mentioned Europe in that quote. Look at the European precedent for what is going to happen here. Now, people say, Australia's not in Europe's boat. Well, we're talking about intention and direction, right? In Europe, it's the pensioners that are being slammed the most with all the austerity over there. Helga LaRouche, the wife of Lyndon LaRouche, who we work with in the States, Helga is German, and she does a lot of organising around to fight this austerity in Europe and the banking system and to reintroduce into Europe the principle of sovereign banking, etc. Last year, she had the experience where she was meeting with a top European technocrat in the government of the EU, and this guy explicitly said to her, he just declared that because he's so locked into thinking that the elderly are so expensive and the cost of that the elderly are bearing on the budget is too much. He said, we've got to reduce the life expectancy back to 65. Right? He openly said that. And when that people like that can exist now and be in positions of government is terrifying. Well, Craig, there's going to be some of them in government here, right, who would be happily thinking in those directions. It's similar to the idea of the world being overpopulated. So this is, not good news where we're headed. And the question is, though, is it absolutely necessary? Do we have to have a balanced budget, right? So look, we're going to talk about a historical example that proves that it's not necessary. And it's from Australia's own history. But let's take a break now, right, so that we give ourselves plenty of time to do it. And when we come back, you can tell the story of Ted Theodore. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So we're talking about the 2014 federal budget and what's expected to be in it, and the fact that the cuts that Hockey is probably going to announce, which he will present as absolutely necessary to balance the budget, we are arguing are not necessary. They're a choice, because they're a choice that they've taken to do the bidding of bankers and put the demands of bankers above the welfare of people. So, Craig, the clearest example of how this is a choice and not a necessity is from Australia's own history, and it's from 1932, when we had a Labor government, and they had the question before them of, do they balance the budget? Now, what set this up was the Depression, 1932, and the Depression, the stock market crash per se was not the cause of the Great Depression. That was a trigger. The Depression was caused, especially here in Australia, when the Bank of England reimposed the gold standard, and they drew all this money out of Australia and collapsed the money supply by a third.
Because at that time, Robbie, all loans, you had to keep a percentage of gold in the bank to cover loans. I think it was about 25%.
Yep. And so they imposed that.
Which meant that as the gold got sucked out of the country to pay debts, the amount could be lent into the economy was shrunk rapidly.
Yep. So the Treasurer in 1932 was Ted Theodore. What was his
31
choice?
31, actually.
31 was Ted Theodore. What was his choice?
Well, I think I want to preface my comments by saying there's a presentation on our website that I did in detail about this to really give people a sense of the mindset, this bloody killing mindset that the Conservatives had back then. And people have to realise that when you see that mindset and you compare it to what we got today, it's the same thing.
Yep.
There's no rationality. This is an ideologically driven program which will kill people. And they didn't have any concerns about this in the 1930s, because we had over 10 years of completely unnecessary misery because of a top-down bankers imposed policy. Now, Ted Theodore is an interesting guy. He was very familiar as a Premier of Queensland for many years. He'd seen state-owned industries developed by the state government in Queensland, abattoirs, mining companies and so forth, and a prosperity that came from that sort of regulation. So when he became Treasurer for the second time in January of 1931, he saw the economy in disarray. He tried to get Sir Robert Gibson, the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, to issue credit into the economy, because the problem back then was that consumption was falling. In other words, there wasn't enough money for people to buy the goods that were being produced by the factories and by the manufacturers here in Australia. So consequently, that led to a bad cycle. There wasn't enough people to buy the goods, people couldn't sell the goods, therefore they had to lay off workers because they couldn't produce enough, they were overproduction and so on and so forth. So what Ted Theodore said is we have to increase consumption. And he proposed the issuance of a £17 billion, what's called fiduciary note issue.
£1 million.
£1 million.
That's before inflation.
£1 million fiduciary note issue. Now, fiduciary notes are basically currency notes issued without the backing of gold, because up until that point, all notes were backed by gold. You could take that note into the bank and get the equivalent in gold.
Yeah, Craig, he proposed that, but his other choice, though, right, was the Bank of England had made a demand of a massive round of budget cuts.
Yeah, also Otto Nehemiah had come down just before he became the Treasurer and demanded 25% cuts. Look, take what we've got today, and that was the Nehemiah proposal for the 1932s. 25% cuts of pensions, whatever government expenditure possible, cut it, right? Yeah. So Theodore said, no, let's issue £17 million of fiduciary notes. Let's do this. There's a precedent in England. England could actually issue £280 million This was quite known, it was quite a common principle. And that will spend $6 million of that to fund the relief for farmers in Western Australia and other places. And the balance of it, the 11 or 12 million, it was actually 18 million pound, Robbie, 12 million will be issued on a monthly basis, 1 million million pounds per month in order to fund public works. This would employ 40 to 50,000 people, and the increase in the economic activity would then also fund a further 40 to 50,000 people into meaningful work.
So this was the policy. Why? And it didn't happen. Why?
Well, because basically the Conservative upper house of the government that sort of says, no, you can't do this. Who are in the pay of the bankers? You can't do this. And you also had, Sir Robert Gibson said no, and it was completely blocked. He put this up as a proposal, and he was basically threatened that if he put this proposal up, then the Commonwealth Bank would stop writing cheques to pay the government. So it was an absolute blackmail.
And now the Commonwealth Bank role in this, because this was the government's bank, right? And so Sir Robert Gibson was a bureaucrat, essentially.
Yes.
Its role in actually point blank refusing to do this, what the government had asked it to do, was very controversial at the time, to say the least, as it should be. So, Craig, that scandal led to the 1936 Royal Commission on Banking. Now, I got a couple of quotes from this Royal Commission, because this Royal Commission was mainly conducted by conservative type people, but they were looking at it, by then the Depression had dragged on, so they were looking into, should the Commonwealth Bank had done what the government told it to do. The one person on the commission that wasn't the same as the rest was Ben Chifley, who wasn't in Parliament at the time, but he was a Labor guy, sort of there as a token Labor guy. So the Royal Commission looked into this question, and here, listen to these two quotes from what they found. Point 503 in the Royal Commission's report that was handed down in 1937, quote, "The central bank in the Australian system is the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. This bank is a public institution engaged in the discharge of a public trust. Within the limits prescribed by law, it has the power to print and issue notes as legal tender money, and every obligation undertaken by the Commonwealth Bank is backed by this power of creating the money with which to discharge it. Point 504, because of this power, the Commonwealth Bank can increase the cash reserves of the trading banks. For example, it can buy securities or other property. It can lend to the governments or to others in a variety of ways, and it can even make money available to governments or to others free of any charge." So the Commission admitted that the bank could have done what Theodore asked it to do. Now, that was handed down in 1937. There was a Conservative government in place until World War II. But when Labor took over in World War II, Craig, Ben Chifley was the Treasurer then, who'd been on this Royal Commission. What happened then?
Well, basically, Australia was abandoned by Britain. As we talked about that last week. Malcolm Fraser had various comments about that last week. And therefore, we had to look after ourselves. And the bankers obviously thought, oh, heck, we're in trouble here. We've got to do what's got to be done. So in 1978, the expenditure of the government was £78 million. Sorry, in 1929, right? Yep. It was £78 million. Now, it stagnated for over 10 years up until about 1939, where it was £88 million. And you can see this on this graphic that we've got on the screen now. And the point is that then the actual power of the creation of credit kicked in through the Commonwealth Bank and through other measures, whereby they were issuing, in the height of World War II, £677 million, or that was the expenditure of the government at that particular point. So it showed a massive increase of expenditure.
But it was all on the back of that green line, which is the money, direct money issued by the Commonwealth Bank.
Yeah, and the point is this could have been done through the Depression. Yep. This is exactly what Ted Theodore was arguing for.
Yep.
So the principle was clear. It was simply a political policy of austerity, which is exactly what we've got today, that was saying you can't do this. And in today's terms, what do? You have large-scale infrastructure development projects funded by central credits, just like through Commonwealth Bank we've proposed, and get away from funding speculation. Yep. The problem is we don't have a consumption problem so much, because we have a problem of where the money is actually expended to in this economy.
All right. Well, thanks, Craig. We'll take a break now. When we come back, we're going to talk about another idea that might help with the budget deficit. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, the feeding frenzy of financial speculation that must be taxed and killed. So, Craig, this week we put out a press release calling for what we call an effective budget solution. If they really have to balance the budget, here's a good way to do it. A small tax, actually a tiny tax, 0.1% tax, which is $1 on every 1,000. And that compares to the GST, which is $100 on every 1,000, and company tax is $300 on every 1,000, etc. So $1 on every 1,000, tiny tax, but it's on speculation. And this tax would raise $135 billion in its first year. Now, why would it raise so much money? Because the speculation it's taxing is enormous. It's mind-boggling. On the screen, have a look at this table here. This is from the Australian Financial Markets Association's annual report, and it says summary of market turnover. So if you see the column in bold, second from the far right, 2012-13, right? This is where turnover is at the moment, and the bold line, 2/3 to the bottom, all financial markets. You see that figure, 135 trillion. $348 billion was the annual turnover in all financial markets in 2012-13. Now, how much of this relates to the real economy? Right, because look at you can see government debt securities, non-government debt securities, negotiable and transferable instruments, repurchase agreements, swaps, overnight index swaps, forward rate agreements, interest rate options, credit derivatives, foreign exchange, currency options, equities, shares, options, futures options.
Talk English, please, Robbie.
Well, people read it themselves. This is all the derivatives bubble that we've been carrying on about, right? But this gives you the scale of it. So let's just go through some of it. Government bonds. Now that is real, right? Government bonds are what governments issue to borrow money. The turnover in that year was $1.7 trillion. Well, that year, the government probably issued less than $200 billion in bonds. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't the purchase of actual bonds by investors that accounted for that turnover. It's the speculation in those bonds, right? Shares. Look at the question of shares. $1.15 trillion turnover in shares. Most people in Australia, regular people, that's probably what they're most likely to be exposed to through their super funds, right? Well, again, most of that is speculation. It's turnover.
Less than 1% of the total, yeah.
Yeah, if you buy a tax, if you buy shares so you can invest in the company, which isn't speculation, you want the dividend from the share, well, you're not going to be bothered by $1 of tax on every $1,000 of purchase. But if you're a speculator, like these high-frequency traders that we talked about the other week, and just normal speculators, you're going to hate it. In fact, this tax will kill you. And then the biggest ticket item here, look at foreign exchange, $42.403 billion. Well, Craig, that year, the total value of imports and exports in Australia was $620 billion. So that means only 1.4% of all foreign exchange turnover related to actually importing and exporting physical goods and services. Right? So that's all speculation as well. And the problem is it's not benign because it rigs the markets, right? Drives down prices to producers, drives up cost to consumers, and every transaction makes a profit, and that's money dragged out of the real economy. So this is a tax that's actually not designed to raise money, it's designed to kill it. But I wanted to give the viewers a live example of why it should be killed. Anyway, thanks for being here, Craig. That's it for the CEC report. Stay tuned for more.